Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Whitehead, your host, and today we're going to talk about an issue that has really kind of become to encompass a lot of my life, frankly, and become an issue become extraordinarily passionate about, environmental justice. I have a technical background in air quality work and have been doing so for almost 20 years, but I really only found my way to environmental justice, especially full time, over the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of that was actually driven by what was going on in the state I'm from, actually, New Jersey. So I was fortunate enough to start developing relationships and friendships with some leaders across the country. And we are lucky to have two of them here today. First, and no particular order here at all, I'm going to introduce Sean Moriarty, former assistant director, deputy commissioner. He's going to correct me when he comes on, of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and currently head of government affairs for Archer Public Affairs. So, Sean, if you can come on, please.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And last but absolutely not least, we have Jeremy Orr from Earthjustice, who's the director of litigation and partnerships with Earthjustice, and he's gained notoriety around the country for work in Michigan on environmental justice and specifically on water. And I've always been a fan, especially over the last 4 or 5 years or so. So I'm excited to have him on also. Jeremy?
Chris, happy to be here, man. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Absolutely. So I don't know, maybe Jeremy first. Can you tell us quickly how you first got started doing environmental justice work?
Yeah, sure thing. I got started early in my career. My first job out of college was a community organizing job. Was organizing churches around a number of different issues, from transportation, affordable housing, youth violence, and drug prevention. And it was this environmental issue that came up, which was a contamination of a old abandoned site in a neighborhood, that low income Black and brown neighborhood, that community members were told had been cleaned up back in 1990, and this is around 2010 or so. It turns out it hadn't been cleaned up. And as we began to organize around it, I didn't have the language or the terminology for it, right? I just knew that there was this marginalized community of low income, Black and brown immigrant, predominantly immigrant folks who were subject to this environmental degradation, right? Disproportionately, it wasn't happening anywhere else in the city or in the region, just this neighborhood. And that was kind of my first introduction to it. And then got hooked and later began to learn all of the ins and outs and policies and terminology. But that was my first introduction to it in a professional capacity.
Interesting. Interesting. Sean, same question to you.
Yeah, so I think I come at it a little bit more a roundabout fashion, right? So I was very fortunate to be working for the Department of Environmental Protection for the last 6 or 7 years before leaving recently, and I think my eyes really opened to the issue kind of there's like really, I guess, two key things. So first, I'll tell a quick story. So when I was chief advisor for the department, so I was the head lawyer, basically general counsel, and we had a meeting with a prominent environmental group from one of New Jersey's largest cities, and it was about an issue related to kind of like a compliance record for a specific facility. And I was briefed by staff, and went in there intending, as you dealt with people all the time, to give kind of the standard answer. This is what we did, this is what we did. And that proved to be extremely dissatisfying to the folks on the other end, to the point where somebody who I would now call a friend said that I should be fired. And that really hit me hard. And I said, there's something I'm not getting here. There's something that I am missing, right? And I think she had a point. I was not doing the job I should have been doing. We were not extending ourselves in the way that we need to extend ourselves to protect folks in this community. So that really kind of opened my eyes. So there's something more here that I, as somebody who was very privileged to be at the top of an environmental organization, had to pay a lot more attention to. Fast forward to September 2020, Governor Murphy, after an extensive effort by some of those folks who wanted me fired at the beginning of that story, and the work of Senator Troy Singleton and others, signs the environmental justice law. It's New Jersey's environmental justice law, really the first of its kind in the nation, and gives the department this incredible amount of authority to try to begin to address some of those concerns that Jeremy outlined, right? Where folks are being overlooked and they're not having their voices listened to, and frankly being blown off, right? So that at that point, I get the opportunity to kind of lead the rule team in that capacity. We take that law and turn it into regulations. And what that did is really open me up to a whole nother world of people that we were not speaking to on a regular basis. And we did a lot of community-focused engagement. We talked to advocates over and over again. And really, it was an opportunity for me to get educated on the real-world impacts of the work that we do, and how sometimes, as a state environmental regulatory agency, we don't hit the mark. We don't do everything we can. And I think that's really why this conversation is incredibly important for folks to understand that, right? That it's ultimately not personal, right? But we have to open our eyes, and we really have to think and look at the situations that are facing folks in our communities, and do what we can to be able to address that. Whether you have an environmental justice law or not, there are things that you can do to kind of push yourself as an organization, push yourself as an agency farther to offer more protections, and offer protections that are frankly long overdue.
I agree with all that. And frankly, I wanted to start this chat today, as I alluded to in the open, because of the impact that the New Jersey EJ law had on my life, largely out of coincidence, being from the state and happen to be working here and keeping an eye out for stuff that could impact clients. But frankly, it actually has impacted me far more, and changed the trajectory of what I work on every day. And one of the things I've come to learn is the importance of lived experience, something that I will never have because I don't live in the EJ area. I could at best hope to understand what's going on and see the data on a piece of paper and help to translate that to industry. But Jeremy, can you talk for a minute about the value of lived experience and how it can inform our choices?
Yeah, absolutely. I know, as I mentioned earlier, right, kind of my first introduction to environmental justice in a formal capacity, given a name, right? I was older. I've been working as a professional, but retrospectively, right, like I grew up in an environmental justice community, right? As noted, I'm, from Detroit, born and raised here. I still live in the city. And I always tell folks, particularly in my work around water and water access and water justice, in hindsight, looking back, right, our water would get cut off from time to time when I was a child. So I know what that experience feels like, and know that no one should ever have to experience that. I know what it feels like to live in the shadows of an oil refinery that you can see across the backyard, right? Like, and so all of those experiences that I look back on, and now I can name it, right? But they inform so much of our work, especially those of us, right, like on this podcast, who actually work in the field and are doing our best to try to lead and support communities in this work. But to that point, even though we all, in some respect, right, would be considered somewhat experts in our field, it goes back to what you said, Chris, which is the importance of communities, and communities being the real experts in what they experience, right, and more than that, finding the solutions, right, to the problems that we're trying to solve. And and I always say, right, even being an attorney, right, it's so easy to kind of get caught up in the legal jargon and the acronyms of all the laws and policies, but that our communities may not know or understand, right, but they know when the water tastes weird, they know when the air smells funny, right, they know when something is off in their soil and in their yard, and being able to communicate that lived experience is critical to the work that we do.
It could be just because I spend my time staring at Excel sheets all the time. But part of me thought, like, is there a way we could even incorporate that as some type of actual screening step and these various processes that we use? And so I guess Sean first and then Jeremy, how can we get better at public engagement and go past what's just necessarily required of us?
So, to the question, right? And this kind of centers, I think, background what Jeremy's talking about, like this idea of lived experience, right? And how important it is to have, and we call it specifically this and purposefully this in the environmental justice regulations. We call it meaningful public participation, right? And really emphasis on the meaningful part. And that is really intended to kind of differentiate it from that, like, really, like you said, Chris, kind of broken approach of just kind of checking a box. Here's the hearing, whatever, we didn't do anything, right? And what that allows to happen, I think, is maybe we can't put it on a spreadsheet, but that can bring forward the lived experiences and make them part of the discussion and ultimately part of the decision making from the regulator's perspective, right? So what you're doing in those situations is you are really trying to, like I said, you're giving a lot of notice, right? You want to make sure folks know about this. You also want to make sure that those meetings are happening in a place that is accessible to the people in that community, right? We're talking about overburdened communities. I like to call them host communities, really, because that's really what it's about. Like, you are hosting this facility. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the facility's responsibility to become part of that community, to really engage, right? So you want to have the facility holding that public engagement session, that meaningful public participation session in the community. You want to have it at a time when folks can get there. Typically, we advocate for that. We would advocate for that to happen in the evening hours, right? But you've got to be able to assess what is most useful for that community. So when you're doing your scheduling, and also when you're doing your notice, right? The rules ask facilities, there are some basics. You're going to give it to people with 200 feet. You're going to put it in the newspaper. But one of the requirements is to develop a community-specific engagement plan. That's to understand how the individuals in that community will best receive your information. Is that knocking on doors? Is that putting up flyers? Which languages? All of these things to make it accessible and meaningful for people, right? That's the first part. You got to get people in the door. You got to get them to the meeting so that they can be heard. The second part of it, we talked about this. We talked about jargon. We talk about kind of getting ourselves at times kind of wrapped up in the technicalities of this. When you're speaking to people, you have to speak to people and you got to meet them where they're, right? We got to do away with the jargon. We got to do away with all the technicalities. I'm going to sit down and explain to folks what the project is, what the impacts are going to be, and what, as a facility, you're going to do in our parlance to avoid and or minimize those impacts as best you can, right? But you got to be able to explain that to people in a way they understand. And then the third part of that is the comment aspect of it, right? You don't charge people with that technical knowledge. You don't charge them with the responsibility to understand what the fact that the water smells funny or that the air is not breathable in the way that it should be. You don't have to charge them with the technical knowledge of that. You just want people to, you want to solicit their experience. Then it is our job as a facility, as representatives of the facility, or as a regulator, to take that information and translate it into what it can be from a regulatory perspective, right? And that, I think, really starts to bridge the gap between folks having this lived experience and the people making those decisions being somewhat ignorant or uninformed of what that experience is, right? You bring it out, and then you take the responsibility to figure out how you do what you can do to address those concerns.
Definitely well said, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, I think just kind of following up and I guess building on that a little bit more. I think one of the things that I really, when I mentioned, I got to start in organizing, right? Grassroots community organizing, and it was this environmental justice experience that introduced me to the law, right, as a career in a field, and in particular, environmental and civil rights law, that intersection being environmental justice. And one of the things that Sean mentioned a few times that I always go back to is the reason I got into this work from a career standpoint was I wanted to be able to communicate complex information to communities so that they could understand it and use it to protect and advocate for themselves, right? Like that was at the most basic level, that's why I got into this work, right? To synthesize complex information and make it easier. And as Sean mentioned, right, like they like those communities shouldn't be tasked with having to understand. I remember those organizing experiences, particularly organized around this issue that I mentioned. We would meet with EPA and meet with the state environmental agency and meet with the city sustainability office, and they would be talking about CERCLA and RECRA and all these different provisions, and we had no idea what was going on, and we would go spend the next week figuring it out, looking everything up, and by the time we came back for the next meeting the next week, they were on to something else. And this happened about 3 or 4 times until I finally realized, like, oh, like this feels intentional, and they're going to keep talking over our head so that we won't actually be able to engage in a meaningful way. And that's when I knew, right, like, okay, the terminology and the language is just another way to keep these environmentally marginalized communities from having meaningful engagement in the decision-making process. And I think that's just, that's so important.
And I absolutely agree, and I don't want to push back on that, but just to challenge you a little bit, do you think that some of that could stem from people who do this engagement from the industrial end, have experience in sciences and understanding the emissions, and that's their language, so that's how they understand to actually relate these things?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And in that particular instance, it felt pretty intentional and pretty evident because the same people that were talking over our heads were the same people that told this community 20 years ago this site was cleaned up and it wasn't. Right. So in that instance, I think it felt pretty intentional. But to your point, like, yeah, we even as attorneys, right, we talk and laugh about this, right? Like just sometimes how difficult it can be to engage communities. Especially we were talking about engineers, right, and scientists, right? We're not always the best at engaging communities and interfacing directly with communities on our one little niche area that we understand the science and technicality behind. And so to your point, right, a lot of times it's just, that's just how, we may operate in the profession, but also to that point, right? How are you, once you recognize that, right, even on the industry side, once you recognize that, what do you do to remedy that, right? Is it hiring staff, community engagement staff, and liaisons and folks that can break this information down in a meaningful way so that people can engage?
Can I offer a couple follow-ups on that, Chris?
Absolutely, please.
Yeah, so this is an awesome topic, right? So this idea of like how we speak to each other, right? And I think some of like the motivations on each side are often can be very opaque, right? And I think from my experience, at the department, right? Like the people who go into state work, right, who work for the DEP and have worked there for 20 or 30 years, do it because they really care, right? A lot of them, and they're there because they want to protect the environment, right? They want to protect people. And the truth of the matter is, they think they are, right? So like we deal with air issues all the time, right? And air issues become kind of a major challenge in a lot of our environmental justice communities, a lot of our OPCs, right? And people say, well, we protect to the fence line in accordance with the standards, and therefore, the idea is there's no impacts outside the facility. Folks really, really believe that, right? They work very hard to hold folks to that standard. Their authorities can be limited, right? But they hold that really, really tightly, and they want to believe that they're doing it right. So when they're challenged, sometimes they get a little bit defensive, right? They're like, no, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, right? And then there's also, and what this larger environmental justice effort across the country and in New Jersey specifically has helped us to expand those authorities to be able to actually do something, right? You'll often run into people who are like, even if I'm sympathetic, like this is the best I can do, right? Like I don't know what else I can do, and then that can cause conversations to break down. But also highlights another piece of this, right? And what environmental justice at its core, as Jeremy said, is meaningful engagement piece, right? Like this is often a product of people not speaking to each other, right? And having no relationship, right? So if Jeremy is walking in with a group and saying we have these challenges and they've never spoken before, whether it's industry or government, it's gonna be challenging to build that relationship, to ultimately build trust and build a shared language, right? So what we're trying to do here, and I think what we will be successful with, if nothing else, is start to, where necessary, force these conversations, get people to the table, and start to have like human to human contact on issues of importance to communities, and help people on one side to see what it means, and help people on the other side to see that there are humans on the industry and the government side, right? And start to bring people together in that regard, so we can begin to have better, more productive, frankly, more coherent conversations, right? And I think that is really, really critical to success in any of the work that we're trying to do.
I agree. And it also makes me think of engagement work we've done locally and throughout the country, tied to compliance and other issues, that at times it feels like almost when our clients walk in the door, it's almost a predetermined outcome just because of the history that's gone on. But how do we, or is there advice we can give industrial companies and entities to do this the right way, to build that trust over time and be able to objectively tell their story?
I think the one thing that comes to mind, and you were kind of getting at it a bit, Chris, at the end was being able to communicate the progress that's being made, right? And that's transparency at the most basic level. To me, that's transparency. So it's one thing to talk about the progress that's being made, but it's another thing to be able to measurably show the progress, right? And then be able to transparently communicate that and show that to communities, right? Because on one end, like you mentioned, there is a lot of greenwashing going on where you're saying all these things and doing something completely different. But we know that there are other folks who are actually doing the work and may not be the best at communicating it. And I think being able to build transparency into those metrics and measurements and evaluations and the work that you're doing and being able to share that with communities, I think is a critical step in that direction of building that relationship, continuing to build that relationship, continuing to build trust, and ultimately continuing to build right channels and lines of communications over the course of time. Right.
100%. So I think one of the kind of core kind of sub parts of transparency is vulnerability, right? Like if you're going to be transparent and honest, you're going to expose some of your own flaws, right? So whoever you are, and if you're an operator who's operated in a community for a long time and you want to build that relationship, I do think that's the place to start, is to come out and be transparent. That means owning your prior mistakes, right? I think it also means not being afraid to have it said that you're greenwashing the first time you come and talk to folks, right? And the way that you combat that is to come back the second time and the third time and the fourth time and continue to do that consistently and sincerely, right? And help people to understand that you do really mean what you say. It's not about changing your brand. It's not about, it's not about like putting out your big picture environmental bona fides, right? Because what we're talking about here are quality of life impacts in neighborhoods, right? So if you're a big company and you've done a million things overseas to reduce your carbon footprint, that doesn't really matter to the person who lives across the street from your facility, right? That's where you got to focus. You got to come there, be honest, and talk to folks, right? And do that repeatedly. I think that will help you to move past that. And it's gonna, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to intent and follow through.
Absolutely. I want to switch a little bit now to go back to something we first started on, and that's the buildup of state programs. And both of you, as I said in the open, are kind of well known for EJ in the state. But, and just, I don't want to speak for either one of you, but if that's true, there's also 1,000 people behind you who might have been doing this before you were on this issue. And have you ever given any thought to that, for as long as you've been working on these issues in your own state, how far it has come over that time and possibly where the trajectory in the state might be headed?
When people ask, we've talked to dozens of states during our rulemaking process. So we want to get this too. And the first thing I ask them is like, how long have you guys been working on it? Right? Because if you're just starting to work on it now, it's probably going to take a while. Right. And if you haven't built those relationships with your advocates, you don't have that trust, you can't expect they're going to give that trust to you to go ahead and do this the right way. We were very fortunate because we had some of those relationships, right? So you got to, like that preparation, that doggedness, that kind of tireless advocacy on issues like this is what gets it across the line. Our hope, and my hope when I was at the department, was that if we get this across the line first, that other people would have an easier time following. Right. And that's where I hope to see this moving as we move forward. The progress on this stuff is rarely linear. It was interesting when we had an opportunity at DEP to start to negotiate this bill, right, that had been around forever and introduced and shelved and all of that. Like there were folks inside the building who had been doing some version of what ultimately became EJMAP, our environmental justice mapping assessment protection tool, for like 10 years beforehand. Right. So like they were working on all this, not sure it was ever going to see the light of day, but trying to figure out how you would ever do some sort of comparative analysis of communities. So when we had an opportunity to do the bill, we said, hey, let's get that out of storage and let's start talking about it, right? And allowed us to really be able to kind of show folks, this is what it's going to look like. So you put in this criteria, we can do the mapping because we had done the prep, right? And I don't think they ever thought it was going to be a thing. And then a couple months later, they're sitting in a meeting where I'm telling them, yeah, we're doing this rule and we got to figure out how to turn this into a publicly available thing. That was probably a pretty scary moment for them, but ultimately pays off all of that work and just kind of trying to hold the line as long as possible until somebody was ready to pull across.
Generally speaking, can you speak to the advantages for being proactive on this issue?
Yeah, I think so. So, Chris, I've talked about this offline, right? Like this is all brand new, right? So the law goes in place, we put regulations in place. There are no precedents there right now, right? And so that means that I think fairly, industry looks at this as a massive unknown, and you have a permit shield. You maybe don't want to dive headfirst into this new process without understanding what the outcomes are going to be. That's a fair place to be. I mean, from my perspective, like you want to be in the process now, and you want to be setting those precedents, right? You want to be showing what you can do. You want to work through the process. You want to identify the measures that you can take. And I think you want to set the stage for everybody else. I would not want, if I'm an operator in the state of New Jersey, to be waiting for someone else to beat me to the punch and then have to live up to their standards, right? I would want to set the standard. So if I'm operating in the state, I'm moving forward with this. I'm working with good people to work through that process. People like yourself, perhaps, right? To work through that process and set forth the standards that everyone else is going to have to meet. And if I'm a good operator, if I'm somebody who's forward thinking and understands, what my obligations in the community are, I can force everybody else to come to my higher standard, right? It's not, I don't think this is going to be a race to the bottom. I think actually it's going to be kind of a race to the top. And I'm looking forward to seeing kind of the shape that this jurisprudence takes as the department begins to issue decisions. I think they will be reasonable. I think they will be fair. And I think they will account for a lot of the realities on both sides of the equation, both from a community perspective as well as from the operator perspective. But also they're going to lay down some pretty significant markers and some expectations about how we're going to move forward under the EJ law, and how we're going to begin to kind of step by step, permit by permit, begin to improve conditions in these communities.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I've obviously been talking about New Jersey a lot here out of a sense of pride, but then also the fact that it came first for a lot of this. But Jeremy, can any of those lessons learned from New Jersey be pulled over to Michigan or to other states and how they implement their own laws?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like any time you get any sort of kind of bellwether, not even just legislation, but in particular, um, legal challenges and court decisions, right? Like that stuff is going to be critical for how other states respond and how other states draft legislation and create rules, right, that they know will probably be legally defensible based on how we see outcomes in other places. But just at the most basic level, right? I think one of the things that we always come back to, and particularly thinking about the New Jersey environmental justice laws, things that we always come back to, which showed up in our proposed bill here in Michigan, and I've seen it in other places, right? But just the impact of cumulative impacts, right? And being able to account for that in permitting, right? That's the big piece that I feel like everyone is looking to see how that's implemented, how that plays out, and knowing what it means for communities, right? Like can that be upheld? And so there are certainly lessons to learn, and there are a ton of lessons to be learned, right? That we expect to come down the pike for New Jersey that we all could benefit from.
Absolutely. And this all gets tied to examination of public health stressors and impact to those stressors. And each state actually looking at this has a different number of stressors, different way to identify EJ areas. But that kind of gets into semantics a bit. Once you actually understand this stuff, it's stuff people on the industrial side are actually pretty comfortable with doing air impact assessment, doing a risk analysis work. I don't think it should be as scary as some have made it out to be, but that's, I guess, neither here nor there. Pushing the state stuff aside for a second, well, one of the other big EJ drivers I see is the special issues, the special interests, the topics, for lack of a better term, I guess, that been driving around the country. You mentioned one you're known for earlier, actually water issues. Can you speak for a little bit? Obviously, I'm guessing Lent will probably come up in this, but how has it been going in Michigan, and what type of interactions did you have with other states or other groups around the country to try to take on this issue?
Yeah. I think, particularly when we talk about water, right, with the Flint water crisis kind of being the marquee event that really sparked, not just national but international outrage around how water is accessed and handled, quality, right? Water is accessed and handled in the United States. When you have you look back at 2014, 2015, and have a whole American city being poisoned, right, by political choices that were made, right, and then you look and you see Flint water crisis, was followed by a Pittsburgh water crisis, followed by a Newark water crisis, followed by a Benton Harbor water crisis, followed by a Jackson water crisis, right? All of these crises that are now that have since popped up, right? And they aren't new, right? It's been lack of access to water for years. But I think one of the things that I'll give Michigan credit for, particularly our activists and advocates and even government response in the aftermath of the Flint water crisis, was how do we create mechanisms so that this doesn't happen again, right? And if it does, right, we are able to respond to it in a quick and meaningful way, similar to what happened in the Benton Harbor, Michigan, scenario a couple of years ago, years after the Flint water crisis, had a very similar crisis, but yet we're able to replace the pipes within a year because of the mechanisms that were set in place on how to respond to these sorts of crises. But I mean, following the Flint water crisis, we had the Michigan lead and copper rule was revamped, which ultimately led to what we're seeing now, the federal legislation to replace all the lead pipes, proposing to replace all the lead pipes in the United States within 10 years and changing how we sample water and mandating certain inventory criteria. Like all of that, a lot of that came from the Michigan rule that was revamped. And, Chris, I know you mentioned my work in Illinois at the beginning. I helped draft the legislation and pass the landmark legislation in Illinois to replace all the lead pipes, in the state over the course of time. And a big part of that was pulling from what we were able to do in Michigan, right? And even though it was rulemaking in Michigan, we were able to pull some of those aspects and put them into legislation and get bipartisan legislation passed. And as well in Michigan now, we have an introduction of access and affordability legislation that's looking at creating tiered water rates, similar to what we're seeing in Baltimore, right? That are income based, right? Not about how much water you use, but how much can you pay, right? What can you afford, and that shouldn't limit your access to water. So it's been great to be in the midst of that. It's unfortunate that it took a crisis for us to get there, and it took a crisis for America to get there and start investing in historically federal funds, right, in water access and affordability and water infrastructure. But I mean, we're here, and the hope is that continues to move forward.
Yeah, part of that, all that's frankly pretty inspiring to me. But one of the first things I ask myself as I heard you talk there, I wonder how he picked water. How did he know that this is the thing I want to invest myself in? Like I think of Catherine Coleman Flowers and what she's doing on sewerage issues and how just incredible that is. She's dedicating her life to being sure that people have sanitary conditions in her hometown. Is it always tied to this sense of place that brings you to knowing that, hey, water is my issue?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. I think, as I mentioned earlier, like I know what it feels like to not have access to water, quite literally, right? Like having grown up in a home where water got shut off at times, and my parents, to this day, my parents still have these big apple juice used to come in a glass jar. You guys are a little older than me, right? So you probably maybe remember this. So my parents in the basement to this day, they still have in their pantry.
Sean's older for sure.
Right.
Old enough to have drank apple juice out of a glass jar.
Right. So they still have about 20 or so of these glass jars that have been in the basement since the 70s and 80s, right? And they're still there. But that's what we would do, right? So I know that feeling and feel like, no one should have to experience that. The other part is growing up in the Great Lakes, right? If we may have our political differences across the state and across the region, but one thing people can agree on is protecting the water, right? And access to water, especially when it feels like something that we all enjoy in many different ways, whether it's recreation, whether it's for consumptive use in our homes, whatever the case may be. I think it was a mix of those things. And I think the last thing, which I often joke about, right? I say the reason I don't work on climate as much anymore is because it doesn't feel fixable, right? And it's kind of a joke, but the reality is the work I've done on water, I can see the significant immediate impact when somebody's lead pipe is replaced, right? We can see the immediate impact when somebody's water bill is reduced, right, due to some sort of assistance plan or affordability plan. We know what it looks like to clean up our lakes and rivers and streams and the quality, how that impacts the quality of the ecosystem and the environment. So I think for me, at the end of the day, water feels like one where I know I can have a tangible, immediate impact and can see that impact and the impact it has on people's health and the environment.
I guess one more follow up on that, and I want to hear from Sean on this one too after you, Jeremy. But do you think that tangible impact makes water issues more, how to phrase this? You don't have to worry about it falling out of favor if there's another presidential election and things sway back the other way. That it's going to stay more of an issue people can get behind, no matter what changes could happen from year to year.
I mean, you know, even in the midst of that, right, water is like anything else has been politicized, right, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, right? Because one of the pushbacks, and I'd be interested to particularly see how you know, the rulemaking process for the federal lead and copper rule plays out, right? I imagine there's going to be significant industry and municipal challenges to that rule if it stays as is, requiring systems to replace, you know, 10 million plus lead pipes around the country in a 10-year window. I think that and that could easily be, you know, easily be politicized, and not, you know, not saying there aren't valid concerns there, but I think as it at the very least relates to, well, I mean, even not even, right? Because now I'm thinking about the Sackett case, right, and Clean Water Act, right, being under attack. So, I mean, if I had to guess, like, I don't, you know, depending on who's in charge at the state and federal level, I think there are some states, some regions, some places that are always going to do, particularly the Midwest and the Great Lakes, regardless of who's in charge, are always going to do what's necessary to protect water. But at the federal level, I mean, right now we're seeing historic investments in water, clean and drink, you know, clean water, stormwater, drinking water around the country that we haven't seen before under any administration. Who knows if that will continue under a changed administration? But I like to think at the most basic level, if we're just removing the political decision makers, I think the majority of people in America agree, like, water, having access to clean water is an essential priority.
You do like a whole nother like 6 podcasts on the water issues, right? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
and what's interesting as you're talking about like your experience, Jeremy, like the continuum, like the water continuum, right? Like, so you in these situations where you have this crisis, right? It's because of deferred maintenance, because nobody did what they were supposed to do. The reason that that doesn't happen is because water for a long time has been artificially cheap, right? It's a political decision. It's a very local political decision about what you're going to charge folks for water. So then you have deferred maintenance, which causes a crisis, which then puts in place things to address that crisis. Now, that crisis, of course, costs a lot of money to address, right? All of a sudden, you're replacing all the lead service lines in the entire country. We're on a 10-year plan. You guys are doing it. The federal government wants to do it, right? So then that forces a conversation about the actual cost of water, right? As my former boss, Commissioner Latourette, is fond of saying, this like pretty incredible and very like intense chemistry experiment, what it takes to take that raw water, whether it's groundwater or surface water, clean it up and make it safe for you to drink. That's a lot of work, right? And that costs a lot of money. And that cost is often not reflected in what it costs the consumer, right? So then you get to the other piece, which is when you factor in the actual cost of water, it becomes, in some instances, unaffordable for people, right? This cycle that we're in is kind of terrifying, right? And then you have to fix at the back end because we didn't do the things we were supposed to do at the front, right? Like, that's a pretty good example of kind of how like we do things generally, right? Like, we just wait until there's a problem and then we fix it, right? That's why it's a trope in movies. I always talk like the Watchmen comic, right? Like the guy tries to save the world by having a giant squid show up, right? Because he has to create the crisis to get people to pay attention. And that's what we do all the time. And it's frankly insane. And that's part of what we need to do. And like you talk about the current administration, how this becomes politicized. I think what the current administration sees is the fact that when you invest in infrastructure, you're investing in everything, right? You're investing in jobs, you're investing in local economies, and you're investing in people and their health. And your ability to do that will lift all boats, right? And I hope that we'll continue to see it that way and continue to invest in that way that's appropriate so we can avoid these all too frequent kind of like crises that we have to face, which then ultimately cost us more, right? And you can see that in water, you can see it in climate, you can see it in environmental, you see it all across, you know, the topics that you're going to touch on through the rest of this, Chris.
And that's actually a great segue, in fact, Sean, because I was going to go to climate and climate justice next. Climate is, I think, the easiest way to think about it. It just makes every impact more heightened and more likely to happen. And unfortunately, those in overburdened areas are likely to continue bearing the brunt of this stuff until concentrated, action is taken to slowly help fix that. But I understand the frustration, Jeremy, that fixing something like this, a worldwide problem, can't be done hyper locally. So is it just a matter on this topic of building up things like actually flood resiliency, flood control, hyper local issues to try to address it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it, right? Because as you talk about it as a, the climate crisis is truly an existential crisis, right? And if that is the case, then like that crisis is out of the hands of the individual person on a daily basis, right? And it requires some significant, very timely revolutionary changes in how we operate globally, right? Particularly in the global north, right? Which is the geography that caused this crisis that we're facing right now, right? So we get to this space, and then it becomes okay if we're at the political will of decision makers and corporations who we are relying on to do the right thing morally, right? Then we're going to be waiting on that for a while. So then the question then becomes, how do we ensure in our local communities that these local impacts or the local changes that they're having influence and promote our health locally? So as you talked about getting into climate resilience, as you get into, flood infrastructure, as you get into air monitoring, right? And all these things that impact, people's health and well-being, and impacts people, particularly as I think about environmental justice communities and low income communities, right, that are disproportionately subject to environmental degradation. Like, how are we, shaping local and state level laws to ensure that at least the local impacts are improving for people on a regular daily basis?
Think about, I mean, just like existential is really the only appropriate word to describe this, right? And when you think about like this, the scale of it, right? These are large systematic changes. It's like society needs to change as a whole in order to deliver us from the impacts that are coming, right? And that's not something that you can do, necessarily in your day-to-day life. You can help, you can, get an EV, and you can be more sustainable and try to reduce your personal carbon footprint. But like those have to be larger scale systematic changes, right? And I think that what we are left with, individually at a community level and even a state level is trying to adapt and become more resilient, right? And trying to take steps that we can take to ultimately protect ourselves from the impacts that we are already experiencing and are going to continue to experience, right? And like from an environmental justice perspective, we tried to incorporate some of these things into the rules. Part of our kind of reflection of environmental and public health conditions in our overburdened communities is kind of looking at some of those indicators that are reflective of climate and the climate impacts, right? You look at impervious surface, you look at flooding, you look at tree canopy, some of these things that lead to these very hyper local impacts like heat island effect or increased flooding. And hopefully being able to use the rules and some of the other things that the state is doing to start to relieve some of those impacts, so that disproportionate climate burden is not felt so acutely in our overburdened communities, right? And we got, a lot of this is just about sharing benefits and burdens, equalizing benefits and burdens, right? And we got to do what we can do as a state and as individuals to kind of better assess and better protect folks from those impacts that we're feeling in. There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work.
Absolutely. And that kind of goes to something we were talking about before, the importance of cumulative impact analysis. And I find a lot of people, when they start talking about all this stuff, just try to focus on air emissions and the impact they have, but it's actually much, much more complicated than that, and much more nuanced than that, frankly. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about the importance of whether it's CGEST or the other climate tools for identifying what climate impacts are most important and most of an issue locally to potentially better inform planning, whether it's on a company level or city or state, wherever the case might actually be. And whoever wants to jump in that one.
I can just jump in briefly and then defer to Sean. I think one of the things that stand out to me, right? Whatever, because there are a number of tools, right, that we have available now that we didn't have, 10, 15 years ago that get to the indicators of climate change. And we have, them popping up at the city level. We have these federal tools, we have state tools popping up, and we have our own here in Michigan that we utilize for those indicators. But the thing I always go back to is and it's part of that transparency piece, right? But those tools are important because they get to the availability of the data that we need to make the case to uh, to make these changes, right? And anecdotally, we know they're necessary, right? But oftentimes, our decision makers need to be pushed, and they need to see the information 100 times over and need to see the data, right? And now we're in a space where that information is there, those tools are there. So now, how are we using that in a way that continues to move us in the right direction?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, it's having the data. And then I think, we talk a lot about just kind of the cycle of crisis, but like having the real world on the ground impacts to show what that data means, right? So, we get Ida comes through New Jersey a couple of years ago. It's a bad thunderstorm, and there's 10 inches of rain in Newark in a couple of hours, right? Like that's an insane amount of rain. And then you look at the indicators on something like EJ map, and you see, the abundance of impervious cover and the frequency of flooding in those areas, right? And they match up pretty darn well. And you can start to see the picture of how those impacts and how future impacts are going to play out in these communities, and I think that ultimately needs to spur action on the state level. You think about heat island effect, the state through the Climate Council and through some of the work of the department has put out kind of heat maps for the state to kind of show the places where it's much warmer than it should be, or comparatively much warmer than it is in other places, right? And giving us the data that we need to hopefully spur action, and then to kind of concentrate where that action should occur to really provide the most benefit, with ultimately, as we often run into, just a limited set of resources to be able to address these things. But being able to dedicate those resources to the place most in need is extremely critical.
Absolutely agree. And frankly, to be honest about this, I have a hard time not being skeptical about our potential to mitigate some of these climate impacts when you just look at what's in front of us and the fact that as a culture, we're slow to change, and the pace of change and the funding for it, and a thousand other reasons, hasn't happened as fast as we wanted it. But is it as simple as any warming that we can avoid and any mitigation and resiliency we can sustainably put forward will have benefits down the line?
I mean, I think when you're talking about this issue, nothing's simple, right? Like nothing's simple. But I mean, this strikes me as a situation in which we have, current impacts that we're experiencing, and we have an expectation based on, different probabilities and scientific models as to what we're going to see in the future. And I think it's incumbent upon us, as a society, to do everything we can to produce that, whether that's action at the state level or that's action at the federal level, whatever it is, both on a mitigation and a resilience side, to be able to get to these things. But I think your broader point, right, is really good one. Nobody likes change, right? Everybody likes progress, but nobody likes change, right? And just in New Jersey over the last number of years, like, we started a very high level conversation about what climate change is going to look like for the state, right? And that is a key first part, right? But as that conversation has evolved, and as the conversation nationally has evolved, it goes from being this like big picture conversation to something very, very personal. And what this will come down to in the long run, right? As systems change, are people making personal decisions, right? And then that's you end up with the fight over whether, the federal government is going to like break into your house and steal your stove or whatever. Like that's like a wild example of something that's not going to happen, but it is representative of what it means to have to make that personal decision in your home about how you want to cook and how that's ultimately going to affect these things, right? And I don't think these changes come from everybody making good personal decisions, right? I think that humanity's probably shown over time that we don't necessarily do that all that well, that we're fairly self-interested as a species. But when we can get together and change our systems to influence our our behavior in a way that will be protective for us in the long term, that's going to allow us to make it easier for us to make those decisions on an individual basis.
I think that's good, but I don't want to put us in too much of a downward spiral here as far as tone
But you
goes.
wanted to bring climate up at the hour mark, Chris. Where do you think this is going to go?
Yeah, well, I'm going to bring us back up here a little bit. I like to always try and end these things on a hopeful tone if we can. I'm going to ask you also about educational resources after this, because that's how this podcast got started. But I guess Jeremy first and then Sean, what gives you the most hope when you think about these topics, when you think about environmental justice, when you think about climate change, where things are right now and where they might be going? Is there anything in particular that you're most hopeful about?
I was thinking of something that Sean was talking in the question you just asked, Chris. But I remember about a year ago, and I kind of jokingly mentioned my climate pessimism a few minutes ago. But I remember watching it was an interview with President Obama. I think it was on CNN, and I think he was either was in Athens or somewhere somewhere overseas, and they had asked him about the climate crisis, and he made this case, man, that kind of goes along with what we're talking about incremental change, and are there any benefits to the changes that are being made? And he says, look, like, I'll be honest, the chances that we are gonna the chances that we're gonna stop at 1.5 degree increase is unlikely, right? He's like, we're gonna blow past that. He's like, but that doesn't mean we can't make changes and mitigate so that we cap it at 2, right? And that difference between 1.5 and 2 is still a matter of saving millions of lives, right? And saving our environment and shorelines and oceans and all this stuff, right? And that's what I think of, right? When I think of my pessimism, I still think of, okay, we may be behind, right? But that doesn't mean we just give up, right? There are still changes that can be made for us and for future generations to come. And those are the things that kind of give me hope, right? Leading into that question as well, right? There are real changes being made across the field, right? Environmental movement and environmental justice and just sustainability, right? ESG, environmental advocacy across the board, right? There are practical, like, meaningful changes that are being made that are like improving the lives of communities and individual people every single day, right? And it may not be what we see on TV, may not be what we see on the news every day, right? But there are changes that exist and an appetite for those changes that exist that didn't exist even 10 years ago, right? Right. The way we talk about environmental justice when it was so taboo 10 years ago, right? The way we're willing to name it, right? And take account for it is so important. So it gives me hope, right? I think that gives me hope that we're not only seeing the rhetoric, but we're seeing actions and investments, right? And money and changes that are moving in that direction.
Absolutely. Sean, how about you?
100%. I don't want to be a downer, so I'm not going to talk about what the sea level rise projections are if we get over 2, right? That's like the apocalypse. But so I think what gives me hope, and I'm not just saying this because you guys are staring at me on Zoom, is people like you, right? So the work that Jeremy does, people like Jeremy who fight every day to make this world a better place, right? And Chris, you're like on your own accord creating a podcast to talk about these issues and to get them in front of people. And people are going to listen to this and they're going to learn something, and that's a benefit. Like, and like Jeremy said, just the fact that these conversations exist is an indication of significant progress. Progress that did not exist probably even 5 years ago, right? And that means we're moving in the right direction. And I think as long as we continue to be honest with ourselves, continue to have real conversations, continue to listen, and people like the two of you continue to do the work that you do, that gives me hope for our ability to move through all of these challenges and whatever the next one's going to be, because there'll be another one, probably tomorrow. Hopefully I don't say that and then the podcast gets posted and something crazy happens, but you know what I mean.
Sean, thank you for bringing that up, because doing this is frankly just a passion project of mine, but it was spurred by just again and again and again hearing from people we were working with in various communities saying they actually want to learn more. They want a space they can go to for high quality, free education on these topics and trust who they're hearing the information from. And to be very honest, the response I've gotten from various subject experts like yourself coming on this and just honestly has been extremely impressive to me that as many people are buying in as they have. But I always like to ask, because this is all about education, do you have any resources, any of your favorite authors or websites, whatever the case might be, that people can go if they want to actually try and learn more on this?
So I'm probably my favorite author. Um, but jokes aside, I would point everybody to the Department of Environmental Protection's EJ website, right? Like that is to me a treasure trove of information on this topic that explains in somewhat and at times pretty excruciating detail how you get from a bill to regulation and what that all means, the philosophy behind it, and all of that kind of work and information that goes into building something like this from the ground up is all there. And I think it's a tremendous asset. And as part of that is EJ Map, right? That's the department's tool. And you can use that to get a sense of where, where impacts, climate impacts, air impacts, water impacts, what they look like across the state of New Jersey and what communities are more impacted than others. And I think that more than anything else, right? That is a way to educate yourself in a very real way as to what this actually looks like and why the state is doing the work that it's doing. So I'll put a plug out for them. I'm sure Jeremy's got something a lot better than me.
Hey
I
man, I'll put a shameless plug into recently published article in Ecology Law Quarterly at UC Berkeley on America's kind of water crisis, right? As I think about my work on water, and it kind of goes through the history of the contamination of water and the fixes that lie ahead. So I'd say, folks are listening, check that out at ecologylawquarterly.org. And the name of the article is Poor Decisions, Poor is POUR. But then the other thing that I go to, particularly as it relates to water quality issues, is a website called Safe Water Engineering, which is led by Elam Batanzo, a renowned drinking water engineer that was at the center of helping discover and pull the rug out from under those during the Flint water crisis, right? And she's a longtime engineer, been in the field for I think over 20 years now, formerly EPA, and she has a wealth of information around water issues on her website and has a really quirky newsletter that is very informative. So I'll say on my end, being able to check out safewaterengineering.com for some great information.
All right, fantastic. Well, guys, I enjoyed this thoroughly, and I've frankly been looking forward to this chat for a while. So thank you both for coming on. I just want to say that first of all. But then also for everyone listening, our next episode will be on building decarbonization. We'll have the executive director, Cushman Wakefield, on, as well as membership for the Construction Demo Recycling Association. Started thinking about some tangible ways we can actually make a difference in how we build things and how we land things. And if you liked what you heard today, our podcast is available on all major podcast platforms. Another shameless plug. And if you're ever on LinkedIn, chances are you'll find me. I'm on there quite a bit. So again, thank you everyone for listening and have a nice day.